All right, well, thanks for being here. My name is Kouwenhoven, and I'll be presenting the work that I've been doing together with Roy de Klein, Stefan Rijmakers, and Tessa Verhoef. And then I'll be talking about the need for structure and the emergence of communication. And successful communication between humans, of course, largely depends on having shared vocabulary. So the fact that I can be talking to you now is because if I use the word apple, we all know that it refers to this roundish green or red thing that we can all eat, right? And because we have these shared vocabularies, we can successfully communicate. But then there's a problem. So humans have obviously been able to solve this, to create these shared signal meaning mappings to successfully communicate. But if you go way back in time, if there's no signal and there's no meaning, then the question becomes, well, how do we get these mappings? So how do we get a mapping from the signal apple to the meaning, the round edible fruit? So how does a signal acquire its communicative meaning? And this has actually been being studied in the field of language evolution quite extensively. And a general finding from these studies is that humans can actually gradually establish shared conventions through repeated interactions, repeated feedback. And for the current study, we're also just wanting to replicate one of these studies one of these experiments that's been done in the field of language evolution and see if we can replicate those findings. So the contribution of this work is actually twofold. So first, we want to reproduce work by Thomas Scott Phillips and Simon Kirby from 2009, which is the embodied communication game. Some of you might be familiar with. And secondly, we actually wanted to investigate whether an influence for the bias of structure, for structure, can have an influence on the emergence of signal meaning mappings. And this is not just some relation that we're testing, because of course language is highly structured. So we have compositionality, we have all kinds of grammar rules. So it makes sense to see whether a bias or a preference for structure has influence on how this structure emerges. And secondly, it's also assumed in lots of experiments from the field of language evolution that a bias for simplicity or a bias for structure has shaped the language as we know it today. And lastly, in all these studies from the field of language evolution, they mostly focus on having shared conventions or having shared prior expectation and how they are beneficial towards creating these new communicative systems. But we're also interested in, when are people not able to create these systems? So how do differences or mixed prior expectations play a role in this emergent setting? So to do so, we actually have two ingredients. First, the embodied communication game. So that's the experiment by Scott Phillips and Kirby. And secondly, we also need to measure a personal need for structure. So that's the PNS, and I'll explain both on the next two slides. So for those of you who are not familiar with the embodied communication game, it looks as follows. So this is a shared cooperative game. So there's this shared task. And for each player, there's this grid world. And a grid world has 4 quadrants, which is colored randomly by either one of 4 colors, so yellow, green, red, or blue. And you also know that this is the case for both of the grid worlds. But as you can see, you can only see the colors from your own grid world, and you cannot see them from your teammate. And now you have the shared task to end up on a quadrant that has the same color. And this might seem trivial, but on top of that, these 2 players that have that shared task, they're actually separated into 2 rooms, and there's no availability to communicate in any conventional manner. So this enforces that between these 2 people, a new system or a new communicative system must emerge from scratch. Now the participants are told that their goal is to reach a high score, and a high score is defined as consecutive successful rounds. So you can't really play well by just playing very many games, but you actually have to create this robust system through which you can consecutively play successful rounds. So that's the embodied communication game, and then we also needed a way to measure one's personal need for structure, and there's a scale for that. which is called the personal need for structure skill, denoted as PNS later on. And it's known that differences in the need for structure also affect other problem-solving skills, such as mathematical problems, but also learning a new language or text comprehension. And as we've just seen, the embodied communication game is inherently unstructured. Structure must actually emerge through all kinds of communicative interactions. So that's why we think there's this really neat fit between the embodied communication game and the personal need for structure. This PNS is actually assessed through a 12-statement questionnaire that are answered on a 6-point Likert scale. And it measures, well, one's personal need for structure, but also 2 sub-factors. F1 means the desire for cognitive simplicity or the desire for structure. And F2 denotes the aim of restructuring an unstructured environment to make it, well, more structured, or how do you respond to the lack of structure. And because we want to know not only when is it actually beneficial to have shared biases, we also want to know, well, when does it not work, or how can team differences influence the emergence of such signals. We calculate these PNS F1 and F2 on an individual level, but also on a team level. And this sometimes makes sense, because if you think of it, if you sort of have an example rationale, then if 2 people are actively trying to create structure, but you're trying to create a different structure, that's not beneficial for cooperation. Whereas if they respond differently, maybe one tries to create structure and the other one's just actively looking for it, that can be beneficial towards emerging new systems. So participants, we had 20 diets or 20 pairs of participants playing this game for 40 minutes. And after which they first filled out this questionnaire, and then they reported individually whether they thought that communication happened, and if so, what the communicative system was that they employed. And these self-reports become important later on. So, firstly, our work actually replicates the works by Scott Phillips and Simon Kirby, in that it's quite a difficult task. So only 11 out of 20 pairs managed to create this system from scratch as actually reliably, and that you can obtain a high score. And how does this happen? It actually happens in a quite logical way. First, people just try and establish this default color or a common ground. Let's keep the example on the right. So we first always move to red, but at some point red might not be in my grid world. And that's the moment when I have to indicate to the other, well, I don't have red, I need to do something else. So that's when people start moving. And if these movements are actually, considered to be something like, no, not our default, that's when there's a signal, namely these kinds of movements, and the meaning, not the default. And from that moment on, we have the first, for example, if you do clockwise movements, then we have a default color, red, and we have a signal meaning mapping, namely a circle means yellow. And from that moment on, participant or successful pairs could bootstrap this system, so no red, circles, oh no, I also don't have yellow, I do anti-clockwise circles, so that means green. So that first replicates the work by Scott Phillips and Simon Kirby. And then if we looked at the relations between personal need for structure and, emerging new communicative systems, we didn't, on an individual level, we didn't find any relationship. But what we did find is that successful pairs actually make more moves. And that's also something from the original work, where dialogue is an indicator of how successful a new communicative system is. And that's actually shown in this plot right here, where on the x-axis we have the average numbers of moves over all games. On the y-axis we have the high score, and we see that there's this quadratic relationship between the number of moves and the high scores of pairs. And these are all pairs, so irregardless of successfulness or not. And this actually suggests that there's this optimum number of dialogue or this optimum number of moves that one can make to be communicative. And that also makes sense, because too few movements do not convey any meaning, whereas too many movements do not really add any more information to what's already known, right? So, or it can maybe even become confusing. And then, so these are individual results, but we all, like I said, we were also interested in seeing how differences in between pairs, in between participants of a pair, might influence the emergence. So we calculated the team PNS measures, so PNS, personal need for structure, F1 and F2. And we found that, contrary to what's usually assumed, namely shared biases are helpful in emerging new systems, sometimes difference, with what is denoted on the x-axis here, sometimes difference also might be beneficial towards, well, in this case, getting a high score on the y-axis, but towards creating these new systems. But as you can also see, it does not guarantee it. So the usually assumed pictures, namely same or shared biases, shared conventions are beneficial, still holds, but sometimes also differences can be beneficial. And the good thing about PNS is that PNS is the sum of F1 and F2. So we can deconstruct where this relation comes from or how this is built up. So to do so, we took all the 20 pairs and we separated them into successful pairs, good pairs, and medium and bad pairs. And we did this by the reports that they gave afterwards. So if their communicative systems would overlap, then they were considered as a good pair, and if they didn't overlap, they would be considered as a medium or a bad pair. And this also not only gave us a split, but it also showed that the ones that were considered a good pair actually had considerably higher high scores. So that would also, solidify that split. And then if we try to dissect it, so on the top row we have only the good pairs, and on the bottom row we have the medium and the bad pairs. But we only have to look at the top row really, where each column, so the first column is PNS difference, the second column is F1 difference, and the third column is the F2 difference. And we can clearly see that this, the effect that we saw on the previous slide comes from the difference in F2. So if two players of a pair really respond differently to the lack of structure, that is actually beneficial towards creating this new system. And moreover, we do not see that in the bottom row, where medium and bad pairs do not have this effect. So that also ties into the fact that sometimes, not always, but sometimes differences in group structure or in dyad structure might be beneficial, but not always. And then I would like to conclude with these 3 points, namely that our work actually shows that sometimes diverse reactions to the lack of structure may actually be beneficial in creating new communicative systems, but they do not guarantee better performance. And this is something that's just more of a nuanced picture on top of what's usually assumed, namely that shared biases or shared conventions are beneficial. And like I also said in one of the earlier slides, we speculate that these differences might actually be complementing each other's weaknesses. Because usually shared biases are it is more intuitively easy to think why they could help, but differences can actually help by, like I said, if I'm trying to create structure and the other one is looking for it, that might be beneficial. So these differences might actually aid each other's weaknesses. And the last point is we suggest to investigate the need for structure, or the bias for structure on transmission chain experiments, since it's known that biases, such as a bias for structure, is actually amplified over vertical interactions. So we wanted to see, so it might be interesting to see whether this bias for structure can get similar results as transmission chain experiments. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and if there are questions, please feel free.
Thanks for the talk. So I wonder, so did you say the two players, one of, like, they never see the other side's, like, basically board, right? Those, like, grid boards. So,
Yeah.
I wonder, could it, so you say, like, they don't guarantee, like, at the end, eventually, they come up with some communication system, some of them, but it doesn't guarantee better performance. First of all, what did you mean exactly by performance? And second, um, isn't it the case that the kind of task that you evaluated these pairs, these people against, is a little bit not the way we humans have developed language or communication system? Meaning, we have a shared, you know, uh, shared world, but these people didn't have that shared. Like, they had no idea what they're talking about to some extent. Like, they didn't have any feedback. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, so if we, for the second question first. So what happened is, in the beginning, so whilst they're playing the rounds, you can only see what's in your own world, right? But then at some point, you know that you want to end up on a shared color. And if you finish your round, you do have full information of the other's world as well. So that's the moment where also without this feedback, you wouldn't be able to play the game, because then it would truly be, random. And then with regard to performance, your question was that whether a high score is the correct way to measure it, right? Yeah. So we actually thought about that, but so you could not really. So the self-reports, they're just text, right? So if these overlap, that means that they have actually successfully created this communicative system, right? If both players individually report the same signal meaning mappings, that's successful. But what we did see is, so when we split those two into fully overlapping reports and non-overlapping reports, then we saw that the high score was actually also significantly higher than the medium and the bad teams, so where there was no overlap between the reports. So this also indicates, so you would agree that if there's overlap in the reports, that means that a new system has emerged, and that also, or at least we think that it also means that if that corresponds to high score, then we could say that high score is still an okay measure, as an okay measure to see if an emergence, or if a new system emerged.
Yeah, so this is cool. So if the vision I'm getting from this work is that it's like if you have a difference in need for structure, then that's affected because one person might be the leader in creating a new convention, and then you have a follower who will go along with that, rather than having two leaders that have to, like too many cooks spoiling the broth. Mm-hmm. And so we have this game that we call group binary search, where you have two people or any number of people who are playing, and you're trying to reach a particular random number, and let's take the sum of everybody's guesses that you're comparing to the random number. And what we find is that it's most useful for the group if some people are highly reactive to the feedback on whether the group is too high or too low. And if everybody is too reactive or everybody is not reactive, then that's ineffective. And it seems to map onto your task pretty well. And the one thing that our task stresses is that it's not like an individual difference in need for structure or how influenced you are by reactivity, but it's also determined by the group that you're in. So if you're not in a reactive group, then somebody will rise up to become the reactive person. Yeah. So I'm wondering about the possibility of dynamic emergence of need for structure.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. It was also one of the comments that we got by one of the reviewers, where you might want to see how similar processes work if you incorporate more people or more participants. And I also think with regard to the first point that you said, where sometimes there's a leader or a follower, because two leaders might not work, but two followers might also not work. And we actually, at the moment, do not have any way to sort of pinpoint who is whom. But that would be great to look to in the future. Thanks. I guess the floor is yours now, Emily.